Hello, welcome. We're so happy to see you here. Welcome. It is March 21st, 2024. As you signed on, you hopefully heard that we are going to record tonight's session. I'm Jessie Steigerwald. I'm the president of LexSeeHer, and I'm very excited tonight to welcome Margaret Coppe. It is Women's History Month, and so I'm going to go ahead and do my formal welcome. LexSeeHer has a speaker series as one way to make women visible in our community. And we started this back in 2020. We've had wonderful guests. There can't be any guest better than tonight's guest, Margaret Coppe. Many of you have already met her. I've actually had the pleasure of serving with Margaret on the school committee. Margaret has been involved in town meeting. She's the convener of the Lexington League of Women Voters. She also convenes the Lexington Democrats. Not only that, but she was a science teacher for many years before giving her service to the town on the school committee. Margaret's going to talk to us tonight about the League of Women Voters of Lexington, which we will get into the history of it. But first, just welcome, Margaret. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jessie, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this evening's program. So should I go ahead and get started?
Yes, I do want to let people know that actually Margaret also joined us to talk about Lottie Sharfman. That name will come up again tonight.
Yes.
And so if you get really interested, there's another recording that you can learn more about. Yes, without further ado, Margaret, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am Margaret Coppe, and I will be speaking tonight about the role the League has played both on the local and national scenes and in my own personal life. The League of Women Voters is an American civic organization that was formed to help women take a larger role in public affairs as they won the right to vote. It was founded in 1920 to support the new women's suffrage rights and was a merger of National Council of Women Voters and the National American Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman, approximately 6 months before the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The League of Women Voters began as a mighty political experiment, and it was founded on Valentine's Day, 1920, which I think is very appropriate. The League does not support political parties or candidates, what we mean by nonpartisan, but we always work on issues of concern and to the public and advocate after we study them and come to consensus. The process does take time, but not the 57 years it took to get the vote for women. On the national level, the League has lobbied for the establishment of the United Nations, later became one of the first groups to receive status as a non-governmental organization. And in the local League archives, many years were spent studying the United Nations, which today is a surprise to us, but that's what they were doing back in the late 40s and the 50s. The League has opposed voter ID laws and has supported efforts at campaign finance reform. The League pushed for adoption of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. The League endorsed passage of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Law of 2002. The League supports the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Kyoto Protocol. The League opposed the proposed Keystone Pipeline project. In January 2013, the League of Women Voters in Hawaii urged President Obama to take action on climate change, which the League supported. The League supports the abolition of the death penalty, supports universal health care, and endorses both Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act. The League supports a general income tax increase to finance national health care. The League supports abortion rights. The League actively opposed welfare reform legislation. The League opposes school vouchers. The League supports a system for illegal immigrants and lobbied for passage of the DREAM Act. The League advocates gun control policies. And if some of us remember, and maybe some of you do too, when the LWVUS, which is the national one, sponsored and held 3 national presidential debates, 1976, 1980, and 1984. After that, due to increasing pressure from the parties involved, the League withdrew its sponsorship with the following statement. The League of Women Voters is withdrawing sponsorship of the presidential debates because of the demands of the 2 campaign organizations would perpetrate a fraud on the American voter. It has become clear to us that the candidates' organizations aimed to add debates to their list of campaign trail charades devoid of substance, spontaneity, and answers to tough questions. The League has no intention of becoming an accessory to the hoodwinking of the American public. Pretty strong terms. And as you know, what's evolved is the presidential debates are nowhere near the quality that they were of those that the League did. So moving on to Lexington, our local chapter of the League is 80 years old, having been founded in 1944. Over those 80 years, we have worked to implement many programs that have become familiar to residents of Lexington as some of the ones that were instituted statewide. In the 1950s, in the first slide, please, Jessie. In the 1950s, all the major boards, as well as many minor boards and town meeting, were headed by men. The League began to encourage and train women, whether they were members or not, to run for office. And I found this picture from 1955. And as you can see, there are 3 women there, but it's hard to pick them out. And I don't know who they are. There was very little notation on this particular picture. If anyone watching knows who any of these people are, please let me know. So a year after this, in 1956, Ruth Morey was elected as the first selectman, and that's what she was called. She was called a selectman in Lexington. She later was elected the first chair of the Board of Selectmen. Next slide. Moving ahead into 1958, this picture shows some of the early members of the Lexington League meeting with officials. I believe Ruth Morey is in the picture. I'm checking here. Yes, she is to the left. Yeah. Sitting next to her is Betty Clark. And next to her is a woman I don't know. Next to that is some of one of the males. I don't know the next woman, but on the far right hand thing is Marge Batten. Now this is 1958. Marge had not been elected to town meeting, but Ruth had been elected to the Board of Selectmen. And I think what's most interesting about this picture is that all of the women are referred to by their husbands' names. I know. It's okay. This is 1958. This continues well into the 60s and early 70s, where women are identified by their husbands' names. This is not. I was surprised by how long that took to finally acknowledge that women had their own first names. The next slide is one I found that just really tickled me, given that I used to be a teacher myself. This is not a League-sponsored action, but it was a town meeting warrant action. This was a news article in 1961. Prior to this town meeting action, women teachers with the same qualifications were paid less than men teachers. This article finally passed in 1961, but a similar article that was put out in 1947 failed. And I have talked to women who taught in this era, and they remember that women were paid less than men right here in Lexington. So after this time, we're moving on. Both the local and state league had become increasingly active politically. During the 1960s, the league worked on a revamping of the state legislature, namely reducing the size of the House of Representatives from 240 minutes to 160, which was ultimately successful. The next slide. These are not Lexington League members. They are a part of the state delegation, but they were delivering the petition signatures that would place the question on the ballot. Over 100,000 signatures were gathered, and all but 14,000 were gathered by league members statewide. So the league played an enormous role in this. Now, I have heard from some people that reducing the size of the legislature was not necessarily a good thing, but you have to remember they had to get this past the legislature, who would then lose. Some people would lose their seats. So this was not an easy task. And now the next slide, and this is where the local league comes in. This is a picture of, in the middle is a woman named Lottie Scharfman. And Lottie Scharfman is just, what a wonderful woman she was, and what a remarkable person. She is the person who coined the phrase, democracy is not a spectator sport, which is used by leagues all over the country now. She was president of the local league from 1965 to 1967, and she was the state league president and died in 1970 on her 42nd birthday.
Oh.
She was, I know, she was a refugee who escaped with her family from Austria during World War II, settled in Lexington with her family, and who devoted her life to working for the democratic process and to helping citizens gain access to government. She led the Massachusetts League in its successful campaign to reduce the size of the Massachusetts House. And when she died in office, she had just had dinner that night with David Bartley, who was then Speaker of the House, who just recently passed away. And there are people here in town, especially, and I'm thinking of one of the women right now, I'll get to her in a minute, who spoke at her funeral, which was attended by the governor and many of the state delegation, which gives you some idea of how important she was. And the State League established their education fund in her honor, which to this day awards grants to leagues to help them in their local programs. And LexSeeHer, thanks to them, she now has a banner among the prominent women of Lexington. It can be seen today in front of Citizens Bank. So what I found was not only did people in Lexington not know who she was, people in the league, didn't really know, and they didn't have a whole lot of information on her. So it was a pleasure to do some research on her. The next slide is just a fun slide. This is the Patriots' Day in the 1960s, and women were marching in costume. A great tradition for the Patriots' Day parade. The next slide is candidates debates, and you recognize the man on the left? It's Ed Markey. Oh. And he was here in Lexington you can see the banner on the table. I don't know where they were. That's immaterial, actually. We have sponsored candidates debates for many years. What has happened over the last years is that candidates debate for statewide offices have usually are done by a group of several leagues coming together. But back in the day, there were candidates nights. I was reading some of the articles that in Lexington, the 750 people attended. I can't even imagine that today. The next slide is a funny one too. The league also works on voter registration and getting out the vote. Here's one of the early efforts with the "Don't Squawk, Get Out the Vote" car. That's a duck on top of the car. And these back to the days when candidates would drive around town on election day with bullhorns and rooftop signs encouraging people to go to the polls. And so the league was out doing that also. You can see the car. I forget what year that is from. I can't find that right now. So 58. I told you, can you see it?
It's 58. 68?
Yeah.
58.
Okay. 58. Yeah, look at the car. You can kind of tell by that. So I told you earlier that in the 50s, all of the boards were pretty much males. Ruth Morey broke the gender barrier when she got elected to the select board. And as things moved along, more and more women got elected to boards in that. And finally, in I think it's in the next slide. Yeah, the next slide, from 1991, all of the major boards in Lexington were headed by league members, women league members.
Oh my goodness.
Right, and I can tell you their names. Lois Coit, School Committee. Jane Padgett, I think she was Appropriation. Martha Wood was Planning Board. Joyce Miller, Conservation. Jackie Smith, Select Board. Marge Batten, the Moderator. Karen Dukes, can't remember Karen was. I'll have to think about that. And Ruth Nablo. As you know, some of these people have passed on. Marge died a few years ago. Jackie died also. Karen Dukes has passed on. And I think maybe Ruth Nablo, I'm not sure. But that was when you think back to that there were no women, and now there's all these women, and it's continued. There are now women people. They're not all league members, but I think the league paved the way for the women to become active in town, because when it's like anything else, when you see role models, you say, oh, I can do that too. So what happened in Lexington in the 1980s? Well, under the efforts of Judy Marshall, who was the president, and members Joan Clark and Kathy Abbott, the first household hazardous waste collection was held. And that was I believe, the first one in the country. And it was held in conjunction with the town. Also in the 1980s, the league worked to pass an integrated pest management program, which promotes alternatives to pesticide use in town buildings and lands. In 2000, the state passed the Children's Protection Act, which required notification to schools when pesticides are used. And the leader for that was one of our members, Myla Cabot-Zinn. And Governor Paul Cellucci came to Lexington to sign that bill into law. So what does the league do now? We annually support sponsor our candidates forum. It's the only forum that includes all the people running for town meeting as well as town-wide races. We publish an annual voters guide, which used to be in the Minuteman, but now is online as we've moved into the digital age. We have continued with our First Friday series of forums for more than 20 years and continue to plan for more to come. Many men, women, and men too, because men were, I forget what the year was, but the league decided to allow men to join it. And there's been a debate ever since about should it be still called the League of Women Voters. I don't know, maybe someday that name will change, but right now there's not they're not changing it right now. I would like to acknowledge some of the women, and you may remember some of these, and many of these are still active in town, but Natalie Riffin, Lila Grosher, Nancy Ursey, Sandy Shaw, Judy Zabin, both in town meeting, Liz Haynes, she was president when I joined, Pat Costello, who just recently moved from town, Jean Krieger, who's in town meeting, Martha Wood, who's still active, and I believe she's real active with LexSeeHer, right? Yep. Nancy Corcoran-Ronchetti, Wendy Manns, Joyce Miller, Margot Tootin, Ian Gehring, Judy Marshall, Kathy Abbott, Jackie Weinstock, Marge Daggett, Susan Solomon, Deb Mauger, Lottie Scharfman, Ruth Nablo, Kathy England, Sita Olson. There are others, especially going back into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, who I am not acknowledging by individual name, but to whom we owe an enormous debt of gratitude for guiding the league on its road to success. I joined the league in 1983 through the urging of friends. I quickly joined a local study group on education and learned about the league process of studying an issue, arriving at consensus, and voting a position on which we could then take action. I served on the board, eventually becoming president in 1994. I remained on the board until being elected to the school committee in 2007, at which point I stepped down. When I went off the school committee in 2017, I was asked to rejoin the board and did so gladly. I now serve as convener, a new title adopted a few years ago. I was trained as a league moderator early in my membership, and today I'm on the state league list of moderators. I have moderated candidate forums in over 10 different towns and in Arlington for over 10 years now. And the respect that I receive from these towns is due to the respect that the league enjoys. The local league has fluctuated in membership over the years, peaking at over 300 in the 1980s, and has since plateaued at around 60 minutes annually. By joining the league, you become a member of the local league, LWV Lexington, the state league, LWV-MA, and the national league, LWV-US. I would like to conclude my comments with this thought. The more involved one becomes in an issue, the more one learns and the more effective you become as you advocate and lobby. The league has a lot to offer about process, analysis, and advocacy. And finally, the last slide. Jessie, the last slide. There. I just love this picture. This was in 2010, and all let's see. All but one of these women are still with us. It's Judy Uhrig, Martha Wood, Wendy Manns, Shirley Stoltz, Peg Bradley, who has passed away, Betsy Wise, and Sandy Shaw. and they were in the they were dressed up in the parade, and I just love the picture, so that's why I wanted to put it in here. So that's really what I have to say about the local league. And any questions, I'll try to answer them, and if I can't answer them tonight, I'll try and get the answer.
Thank you so much, Margaret. This is a fantastic overview of the league. I do want to ask a few questions, and people who are here, many of you, we all know each other, some of us, some are new, but we hope you'll feel comfortable. You can put your question in the chat bar, or after I ask just a couple, then please feel free to raise your hand and we can speak as a group. Margaret, I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about this idea of being nonpartisan. I think that it may be very obvious to some people, but you read through a list of some of the issues where the league took a position, and some people might think, well, that issue falls more to one party or the other in in a certain year or in our time. But you also refer to this study process. So maybe you can walk us through in a little more detail how that works.
Sure. So the way the study processes work, there are 3 levels that studies are conducted. The national board will usually at their convention vote a study. And then that goes out to all the leagues throughout the country, and they study it. And we get we get information from the National League, and we can do it any way we want. We then meet and we come to consensus. We do not vote. That's a hard concept for a lot of people, that consensus versus voting. But we come to consensus. We forward that to the National League, and then at the next convention, they take. So you can see it takes a long time. This is not a short process. Same thing with the state league. The state will have a study that's been proposed. They'll debate whether to do it or not. If we do it, for example, we are just starting a study on reparations, and we're just in the very beginning of that. And I don't know where it's going, because it's just started. I've been to one meeting. I'm going to another one, and we will get information from the state. Then we'll come to the local league. We will meet and decide consensus and forward that back. And again, they'll have to put together all the state leagues that have submitted consensus. And then we can do local studies, which also take a long time. I'd say a study before we come to the end of it and take a position takes at least 2 years. And that's very frustrating for some people. They want to jump right in and take a position today on some controversial issue. The nonpartisanship is that the league does not publicly support a candidate or a party. But since most of our positions seem to be closely aligned with more progressive politics, we are frequently viewed as belonging to a part, as being biased towards that party. And I can't even answer that. It's what it is. We are, I would say that's become worse in the last 10 years, it actually even 20 years. But back in the early days, that was not as much of an issue as it is now, because back in the early days, there wasn't such a distinct difference between the 2 major parties as there is now, so that's part of it. I'm trying to think of something. I'll give you an example of something that we were asked to take a position on that we didn't, because we had never studied it. And it was back when the seatbelt laws were proposed in Massachusetts. And we were asked to support it. And we had to say, no, we can't support it or oppose it, because we've never studied it. So as a league, we can't take a position. Now, individuals are free to, of course, but that's always been a good example of something that came up that was not studied. I think the last, what?
It makes so much sense when you talked about the league getting started after women finally won the right to vote, because then you start talking about, as you said, how are you going to use that vote? And it sounds like you're saying it's like you want to be an informed voter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really a very important part of the league process is being informed. So now here's another tricky part. When you are, it's like when people try to write say a letter to the editor saying, I support position X, and I'm doing this as my own self, not as a member of the league, and yet you are closely identified with the league. That's most people, they say, well, you can't really do that. But that doesn't come up very often, actually. but that's, I mean, like I say, you can obviously do that. You can work for candidates. You can donate money to candidates. As individuals, that's all up to you.
Did it feel more like people had a practice of waiting until after the forum, the league's candidate night, to endorse locally?
Well, in the beginning, maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I do think there are people who come to our candidates nights to hear and make up their minds. I think there are people who come to support a particular candidate, to be in the audience for that person. And but I do think there are people who genuinely, and I've heard people comment about the candidate debates for the townwide, that after the forum, they will see distinct differences between candidates. And I see that also. I mentioned that I do a lot of moderating around. It's very interesting. Once you're on this list, you get calls to do this all the time. And I'll go to Arlington, for example, and I've just been to Winchester, and then I'm going to Drake it next week. And I will come away saying, well, if I were going to vote, I would vote for candidate X. I just from listening to their responses to the questions. And so that's why the questions are important that are asked at these events. And I would say most of the leagues either do the questions like we do on cards from the audience, or they advertise it ahead of time, and people can submit the questions by email, so that they are not usually made up just by the league. They're made up by anybody who's interested. And sometimes you get questions you wouldn't have thought of, quite frankly. So that's a good process.
Now, you said you went through special training, and it does show when we go to the Lexington candidates night, and we have a moderator who comes from another town, and she's been coming for a long time, but there seems like a very even way that things are structured. It never looks like she prefers one candidate or the other, and the time is very carefully enforced, so nobody's getting more or less time. Have you found those strategies? Do you just sort of do the same thing wherever you go? Is that like part of the secret of the sauce? Yeah.
Yes, it sure is. It sure is. I will say that the training I had was through the league. And then when I first started doing moderating, I had sort of mentoring from some of the state league presidents who I knew, especially when I had a particularly contentious candidate, say at a debate. They were very helpful in how you handle it. And I'll just tell you one of the things, and it doesn't sound like much. I always insist on meeting the candidates face to face and asking them if they have any questions before we get up on the stage.
Oh, that's nice.
I wouldn't have thought of that. That comes directly from the league training. Because people who are running for office and being questioned in public, they're nervous. Even if they're seasoned, they're still nervous. So that's a lot of it. The timing, the thing about having somebody come from another town is so entrenched now in the league. That's why they have this list that they maintain. And sometimes they'll just send an email through the whole list. They'll say, we're having a candidates night in Stoughton. Can anybody do it? Kind of things. Right. And then sometimes you get contacted directly because they've either had you, and then once they have you, unless they're unhappy with you, which I guess could happen. I did the mayor's debate in Woburn last fall. They had a preliminary vote. They had 3 candidates, and they were narrowing it down to 2, and then they had 2 candidates for the mayor. And I did both of those, and it was very interesting. I mean, I find that it's interesting to go to other towns and see what their issues are and how they think about things like roads and sidewalks and schools. And sometimes it's not much different than Lexington, and sometimes it is.
We have a question in the chat bar. I want to go over here. This is from Beth Byers. She says, hello, in your experience with the state and national levels of the League of Women Voters, have you observed great differences among regions of the state or the country in terms of what is supported or what drives consensus among members? If the League of Women Voters is seen more these days as being a progressive organization, has that made the work of the League more challenging?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The one of the most shocking things to find out when you go to a national convention is that League members from the Western states, they want to talk about water rights. And I'm like, water rights? What's that all about? Well, that's a big issue out there. So yes, different parts of the country. Some of the more conservative states, the leagues reflect that. They are more conservative. But in general, even in the more conservative states, the people who belong to the league tend to be more progressive. So they eventually come along. And the National League will make, eventually when they come to consensus, they don't hesitate to make statements. And a lot of what the state and national leagues do that we don't see, they give a lot of testimony at hearings. They have specialists who are experts. We have specialists in Massachusetts who I'm in awe of what these people know about what's going on at the State House. And they go there pretty regularly to testify on behalf of the league. So we have that presence is pretty well documented. Now, what was the last part of her question?
The last part was, if the league is seen as more progressive as an organization based just on the issues that have emerged, has that made it more difficult? Has it made the work of the league more challenging if people perceive the league a certain way?
I think so at times. There was a time when how we used to get those local telephone books, do you remember what telephone books were? You see the local ones,
right?
And some of the towns around here, they were put into those books as the League of Women Vultures.
Oh,
oh yeah.
Ouch.
Yes, so yes, it does. And there are times I had trouble. I was organizing a candidates debate one time here in town, and it was for state rep. And the Democratic candidate, okay, fine, he'd show up, no problem. And the Republican candidate not only wouldn't show up, or I couldn't talk to him, he had people who talked to me, and they weren't about to do, they really were being very recalcitrant. And we cannot do what's called a vacant seat debate. We can't have just one person. So if they don't both come, then we can't have it. And that's pretty standard for our organization. Well, I ended up calling the local, the chair of the local Republican town committee. And I told her what the problem was. She was very nice. I said, we're having a problem with this. And the next thing I knew, he was coming to the debate. So yeah, it is challenging at times. That has kind of gone away. I don't know that we had trouble with who was it that ran? It was when Catherine Clark was running, and there was a candidate running against her who was a Republican. I think we eventually had a debate, but it was not easy to set up because it was perceived that the league favors the Democrats, that we're more progressive. And quite frankly, when you listen to all our stands we have, we are more progressive. So there are times when it makes it difficult. Yes.
Yes, we have a comment in the chat bar, which is a big boo on the calling the League of Women Vultures. Now, that idea, though, of the name calling, certainly when suffragists were out there advocating for the right to vote, they were often ridiculed and made fun of. And, horrible depictions of them were put out in newspapers, making them look like monsters, or just really very disrespectful, implying that they were less than human and shouldn't be allowed to vote. So it's not shocking. I'm really curious. So two of the women, maybe more, but at least two of the women who are in the LexSeeHer Monument, Ruth Morey, who you spoke of and showed a picture of, and Marge Batten, who you also spoke of and put a picture up. So those two women are in the LexSeeHer Monument. And as Margaret mentioned, Ruth Morey was the first woman to be elected to the select men at the time, now select board, and that was in
Yep.
1956. And then Marge Batten served in the select board, and then in 1986 was the first woman to be elected as town moderator. So I have a
Right.
couple questions about them. One is they were both in the league, and it seems like from what I see from Ruth Morey's materials from when she ran for office, these materials are at the Schlesinger Library. And Ann Engelhardt on our research team went and found her actual like campaign brochure. So she had been the president of the town's Republican Women's Club for a period of time.
Right.
So she was clearly in the Republican Party. I can't speak exactly to Marge Batten because I haven't done that research or read about it yet. But these two women were really breaking the glass ceiling. And yet they were both in the league and perhaps had some different views over time. I'm curious about one, how does the league preserve things? Because you have these great images to share with us. Do you have minutes? Do you keep records? How could people learn more?
Well, that's a good question. I have a couple of boxes of decaying papers sitting here right now. That's what I was going through. Some of our stuff is at the Lexington Historical Society. I don't know exactly what they have. I'd have to go in and talk to them, but I know I have the documentation from them that they have some of our stuff. And I think a lot of what they have might be our bulletins and maybe minutes. I think the bulletins would have been the more pertinent thing. We do try to put out a monthly bulletin, and that usually has a lot of information about our stands and our activities. But that's basically, yeah, that's a real problem that I think many volunteer organizations have, is how do you preserve your things in this day and age? It would be nice if I could get some of this stuff digitized, because then it would be easier to keep it. But it's the paper is, some of the paper is crumbling. You can imagine.
Yeah, I'd welcome people putting in the chat bar if you feel like that's a resource you think you'd like to see preserved. It seems to me that because women, it's hard to do research about women, partially the reason you mentioned earlier, even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, sometimes if you don't know the woman's husband's name, you don't find her. You can't do a search in the Minuteman and necessarily find anything about her at all. I worked on Ruth Morey, so I went down that path and learned it's pretty hard. And she was a community leader, so it
Yep.
shouldn't be that hard, right?
Right.
Interesting.
We have one of the early presidents who we cannot find what her Christian name is. I call it Christian, and maybe she might have been Jewish, but what her name was, because she's everywhere referred to as Mrs. whatever, and I'd have to look and see what I've tried to do is talk to people right now. They're getting up in age. One of the great resources for the Lottie Sharfman information was Natalie Riffin, who I believe was she the first woman elected to the planning board, and she was on the select board. She was on the select board when the infamous when John Kerry came through, and they the veterans wanted to camp on the green, and the board of selectmen wouldn't let them, and they arrested a whole bunch of people, drove them off in buses to the DPW barn to book them. She was on and she was so put off by the men who were on the select board that she didn't run again. It was so offensive to her. And she's at Brookhaven, and she was lovely to talk to because she has memories, but those people are starting to disappear. And we have some in town meeting who knew some of these people: Sandy Shaw, Judy Zabin. Trying to think who else is in town meeting right now, who would have been in the league leadership, who would have known these women.
And I think you and I chatted about this briefly, and maybe other people who are here have heard of this. Someone mentioned to me, Lexington was, as far as I know, for a period of time, heavily Republican, and there's a shift over time, and perhaps it's more Democrat now. And there's a substantial number of people involved in local government because we're still a town meeting, but it doesn't mean people all come out to vote and are civically engaged the way you are, right? So you're kind of top of the heap for civic engagement, which is why it was exciting to have you speak tonight. But I was curious about how the town might have made this shift. And someone had told me that the league was very active in encouraging women to register independence. And there was this campaign called Wouldn't You Rather Be an Independent? And so I don't know how much, anyone on this call knows about it, but it's certainly something LexSeeHer is interested in collecting stories about, because women have had a lot of power, even when they couldn't vote or even when they weren't serving on boards, just because people talk to each other or they're gathering to do the studies that you described. There's this reputation that groups of women don't get along when they're working together in a group. And it seems like the League kind of defies that. Do you feel like
Yeah.
women were able to get along well, even when they maybe didn't totally agree and you were taking these issues?
Yes, people, there was, because I think, I'm sure there were people over the years who came into the League and then left because they didn't like the way the process went, but it wasn't because they didn't like the people. And I think that's interesting. Like there are obviously people of different things, different beliefs and strongly held beliefs in this town. But I don't think that's I don't think it's much of a factor in this in local stuff. It may be on the national level, but not. It's the couple of changes that I've noticed. First of all, the women who were involved in the League, in starting with people like Marge Batten and going Jackie Davison, going up through into up to 2000. There were a lot of women who were highly educated. I mean, they went to fine colleges, they had good educations. They may have worked outside of the home for a year or two, but most of them were home raising children. And they were well educated, intelligent. They wanted to do something. So this is where they turned their energies to it. Today, it's different. Today, the women who are highly educated have many more outlets. And in Lexington alone, look at all the volunteer groups we have now that we didn't have 20 years ago, even maybe 30 years ago. I'm thinking of the ethnic groups, the environmental groups. So everybody has more outlets than they had back when Marge Batten was coming up through the ranks. And I will tell you, Marge was an absolutely wonderful woman. I can't say enough about her. And Deborah Brown, who is now our town moderator, follows in her steps. So I got into town meeting when Lincoln Cole was the moderator.
Mm-hmm.
And things got very different when Marge got to be moderator.
How so?
Well, and who got appointed to the financial boards.
Oh.
Marge was very careful to appoint people of opposing views. And again, that comes out of her League training. She didn't just appoint her friends, which Link kind of did, it was much more of an old boy network. He was a very nice person. I'm not commenting about him as a person. I'm just commenting about the way he did things. And I think that town meeting definitely got better. And I have a little story to tell about her in town meeting that you'll appreciate. When I first got into town meeting in 1983, people still smoked a lot, and they couldn't smoke in the hall, but they could smoke in those hallways on either side and in the entrance way. But that, so what? So, people would go in and out, the doors would open and close, the smoke would drift in, and it was really quite obnoxious, quite frankly. And the first year Marge got, and Link, I wouldn't have even approached him. First of all, I was a new town meeting member, I wasn't going to do that. But he also smoked. He used to be up at the moderators thing, and then all of a sudden he disappeared. He was out on the stoop outside having a cigarette while the town meeting was going on. And so I go to, I know, it's so different today. We went to
Very different, right?
So Marge had, as the moderators do now, after town meeting ended, she had a session where you could come and comment on what went wrong, what worked and what didn't work. And I said to her, Marge, is there anything we can do about the people who are smoking inside the building, not in the hall, but in the building, in the things, because the smoke drifts in. And without a hesitation, she said, well, yes, she says, there will be no more smoking in that building. and that was it. Of course, now state law forbids it, but that was prior to state law forbidding it. And I thought that was just, to me, that's like, really, that's all I had to do was speak up and say something. So
It makes it seem very simple, right?
I know. I mean, it is amazing to see. You know how the town meeting goes on the bus tour every year to areas to sites of interest that are going to come up in town meeting. And when I first got in town meeting, the guy who ran the bigs, it was Jim McLaughlin of the McLaughlin. You know, you see the big trucks all around town with McLaughlin on them. Well,
Yep.
that was his company. He would be out in front of Cary Hall with the trunk of his car open with a cardboard box in the trunk. And you'd give him, we'd pay to go on the bus tour, $5 or something. You'd give him the money and he'd throw it in the box. And he'd make change out of the box. He had no idea how much money he collected, or I mean, it was really very informal, shall we say. There was not much accounting. I don't think anybody thought anybody was doing anything nefarious, but
The
so
bus
there was
tour,
that.
how long has the bus tour been happening? Is that when it started?
Well, it was going on when I got in 1983, so it's been going on for a long time. I don't know where that got started.
No, I want to check in. There is a comment agreeing that it would be probably difficult for the league's actions and decisions to be preserved and digitized for future review and scholarship, but hopefully maybe there's student interns who could be recruited for the task. So that is something that is good to think about. We'll definitely follow up. Thank you. That is a great comment. And I do have some other things I want to check in about, but I want to encourage people, if you're on, I see you, Francine, I see you, Mary, and I see Ann Freimer's here as well for sure. If you have league memories that you would like to share, we would love to hear about them, because actually capturing it this way is one way to preserve the history. It's nice knowing the stories of the people who are there. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit about a change. My first league candidate forum was at Clark, and it was very packed. And it was, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I do remember the first sort of contentious issue I heard about, and the first time I met Bev Kelly was when there was a proposal from Bev to limit the number of yard signs. And I remember I came and I went into some room at the school and she was speaking, and I've come to be friends with Bev Kelly, but I really disagreed with her. And I remember going home to my spouse and saying, wow, I have found my people, because there were like a lot of people packed in a room having a very civilized disagreement about political signs. Francine, I see you laughing, so you remember that issue. Right?
Oh, I remember it well.
Right. And so like that was a huge issue, but it was packed. And it does seem like there are that at that time I was only aware of that one candidate forum. And now there's many different fora across town. I'm just curious about your take about that.
Yes, well, that was the only well, there were smaller ones. Miriam Hill had theirs for many years, traditionally the day before the election. That's been around for a long time. And when I was running for town meeting and stuff and different times, East Lexington had one, but then it disappeared. Belfry Hill had one for a while, and it disappeared. The South Lexington Civic Association has had theirs for a long time, but they only do they do the townwide candidates and precincts 3 and 9. They don't do all the precincts. Same thing with East Lexington. The same thing with Miriam Hill. They just do, I think, precincts 5 and 6. So that was different. But then in the meantime, some of the new organizations like CAL and KLEX and COLEX and what's the Indian one? Help me out.
IAL, right.
Yep. Yeah. And they've started having them. I would say that because we're the only ones who bring in an outside moderator, that ours is a little bit, there's less bias. I have attended some of these other ones, and I'm not the only one. I'll talk to people afterwards and they'll say, well, that whoever the moderator was for that particular one, or that was clearly biased in favor of one candidate or the other because they belong to the organization that was doing the thing. And I don't think they've ever come to grips with that. I don't think they even see it. So maybe that's something the league could work on, but that's a big difference in then again, that's why we go into all these other towns. I go into other towns and, I don't know anybody there. And I certainly don't know the candidates. So I treat them all very equally.
And that's where that training comes in so strong, because you're right, a very subtle thing, the way you described it. If we are all sitting in the audience and there's 3 people on the stage and the moderator walks over and is telling jokes with person number 2 is getting special attention, and it may be something someone who's not trained doesn't even think about. They're just saying hi to their friend, but it can create an impression.
That's right. And if you're an outsider, they're not your friends because you haven't ever met them before. So yes, I agree. I did have one instance. I was in Westwood, and somebody from the audience, and I didn't know who that person was either, said, gee, have some of the candidates gotten the questions ahead of time, because one of the women had papers laid out in front of her and would refer to them to answer questions. But fortunately, I could say no. I said, no, they do not get them. I said, however, people who are running for office frequently come prepared for what they think might be the questions. And they have those notes with them. And most candidates do that. I rarely see a candidate who doesn't come with their own notes, because they know what's going to be asked in the town. They know what the hot issues are, or the persistent issues. They know what they're going to get asked about. So, but that was interesting, and I found out later, I think that might have been somebody who was supporting one of the candidates and who was getting a little agitated, but it was an easy question to answer.
So I love hearing about the league, but I did tell people there'd be a surprise, and Margaret has done this incredibly wonderful thing for the community. And I have pictures to share, but I'll start the story, and then if you will jump in. I got a phone call from Margaret that was totally not related to the discussion about the league. And from that, we got some real insight into another woman named Cecilia Payne-Kapashkin, who is also in the LexSeeHer Monument. And I think, Margaret, you go ahead and tell the story, and then I'll share some pictures about what happened next.
Okay. I never met Cecilia Payne. She died in 1979, and I moved here in 77, but I didn't know her. I certainly knew people like Fred Rosenberg, who was an astronomer at Harvard, who knew her, for example. So that was, and I knew about her because I just dropped off. I had read about her, and then I guess I somehow realized she lived in Lexington. I don't know how I realized that. And time goes by and stuff, and I knew where it was on Shade Street. And I never thought anything much more about it. She was a very accomplished, skilled astronomer. She came from England. She was in that group of women that were hired in the early 1900s at Harvard. And she did a lot of work that still stands up today. She's the one who hypothesized that the universe was made primarily of hydrogen and helium, and the male astronomers at the time did not exactly agree with her. So turned out she was right. Anyway, come forward to this year. The house that she had lived in had changed hands and had become extremely run down. It was pretty bad. And I drive by it one day, and I see a developer, a sign out in the trucks, and it's happens to be a developer that I know personally. And I happened to see him the next day, just happenstance. And I said to him, hey, I said, are you taking down that house on Shade Street? And he said, yes. And I said, well, it belonged to a famous astronomer, Cecilia Payne-Kapashkin. And he said, what? And he said, wait a minute. He said, and he had the picture. Do you have the picture, Jessie? There was this thing in the yard that they had found, but they didn't know what it was. It was a granite pillar with a metal thing on top, and it had a name engraved on it. And he had taken a picture of it. So he showed it to me, and I said, yeah, the name was Cecilia Payne. I said, that's it. I said, that was her telescope mount. And he said, what? He had no idea what it was. So I said, this is a great artifact, and she's one of the women on the monument. I said, if nothing else, we should get pictures of it. I didn't know what was going to happen to it, but I put him in touch with Jessie. And Jessie, you can tell what happened then.
Great. I'm going to share a couple pictures because this is such a nice surprise to get this surprise. Okay, I'm going to share my messy desktop. So pay no attention to the desktop. And let me share this picture with you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I arrived there, and Emily, who works with Finnegan Development, had me walk to the very back of the property. And you see kind of, if you look under the snow, what you're seeing is like a playhouse that had big hearts on it. It was like this family grows in love. And there's this stone sort of looking object down here. Leslie met me over there. Now you're getting a closer look down here. It was like really snowy day, hard to get in there. And then here, when you get up close, and I have a few pictures so you'll get closer, you'll notice these prongs on top. That becomes important. Here you're seeing the writing. So this is actually the name of her husband, Sergei, in Cyrillic. And this is Leslie pointing to her name here. And this is going back. Now, this is Tom Burns, who is the curator at the Harvard Smithsonian Observatory. So we asked him to come out and take a look at it and help us try to understand what we were seeing. And here's Emily. And you can see, actually, they seem to have built this at home, but you see this big mound here. Finnegan Construction was very kind, and they asked if LexSeeHer would like to preserve it, which we said we would. And so they offered us the entire earth ball, but we said, no, thank you. We would just go please. It's a little too heavy. So this is close. You can really see where it says Cecilia. And then the name. Oh, here.
So over to my right is what we found, which is a monument.
Wow, look at this. So this was just sticking there in the ground.
Yes, in the middle of the structure, in the middle of the playhouse.
And when you first saw it, this is when you were like, whoa, what am I seeing? When did you see her name on here? Did you know?
Well, at first it was just basically like a concrete monument that was just sticking out of the ground. And like I said, I was with two of my bosses, and they actually pointed out, hey, I think there's something etched in there. I think there's a name in there. So we tried to peel back some of the pieces because it was so dilapidated. We could barely even see like the top of it. We peeled back as many pieces as possible, and we were able to snap a picture of all four sides, try to make out what they actually said. And then, just started having conversations.
Awesome. So
Well, and
all right, Tom,
when Ben showed me the photo he had on his phone, I said immediately, it's a telescope mount. But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't known she was an astronomer.
Exactly.
Because they couldn't figure out kind of what it was, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'll play just a little bit of Tom.
Look at that. So, it's a concrete pier. We got some signs of like a mold likely being used to create it. Then even going down here, there's a big foundation. So it was in a oddly shaped shed in the middle. It has rebar with screws originally here, names of the family, and was in the backyard. So the oddly shaped building would possibly be, or I'm more likely than not thinking that this would have been a little backyard observatory for the kids and the family to bond.
Awesome.
So this, these not being bent over, but being straight up would be where you could actually have attached a telescope to it. And then the kids' names are celebratory of the time. And then we have a date back here that is 1938. So it gives us this perfect time of kind of them. I believe this is close to when they moved out here to Lexington.
Yes.
And the kids got 2 out of the 3.
What happened to the third one?
Not born yet.
So it was a great mystery. And then we're going to figure out, I mean, Harvard would really love to have this pier if we don't place it somewhere, because it is really, she's an incredibly significant scientist that many of us probably never heard of, but she's worldwide known. I mean, she's really incredible what she did. Anyway, so thank you so much, Margaret, because it would have been missed.
Pure serendipity, pure. I mean, I can't tell you. And I will say this, Ben was so cooperative. He even told me he went home and looked her up in Wikipedia to find out more about her. So,
Well, and we've made a pitch and he's open to having some kind of marker or something that becomes, they're building a new house there. So if
Yeah.
you're listening and you would like to live in that same place, what we learned from Tom is that, to put it succinctly, it's a whole separate talk, but Cecilia was very active in supporting refugees during World War II, and she would invite people back to her, quote, farm. So when Tom was walking around the property, he thought, it seems kind of small for a farm. But then Emily explained that originally the property was one piece with the property next door and next door and next door. So it was a much bigger property and could have felt like a farm, in the 30s and 40s when they first moved out here. And she's a very interesting person. I want to let people know, before we go, I'm watching the time, that next week on March 27th, Mary Keenan is going to be with us. We will be at Cary Library. We're really appreciative that Margaret was willing to do Zoom because we know we have people who prefer the different places to be. And Mary will speak about her book. If you keep in mind, please, for next week, the photograph Margaret showed, and Margaret, I'll probably bring it back, of the women using the petitions to actually advocate to lower the number of legislators in the state. It goes to speak to what Mary will talk about in the power of petitions. So keep that in mind. That'll be next week, 7 to 8 at Cary Library. Also want to let people know, next Thursday at 3 p.m., we will have a small ceremonial moment where LexSeeHer will give the plaza, the granite plaza portion of the monument, not the whole monument, but the plaza is going to be given to the town next week on Thursday. It won't really be open to the public yet until May, when the whole monument's done. But if you'd like to come down for this little happy moment during Women's History Month, everyone is invited. For those who are willing, please feel free to put yourself on screen and join me, or at least unmute if you don't want to be seen, as we just deeply thank Margaret, not just for speaking with us tonight, but for all of her service to this community. We are truly, as a community, way better off, not only for your work with the League, and also for your work with town meeting and for the many other projects you do, but also for helping preserve this little slice of history around one of the world's most famous astrophysicists, period. So thank you.
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you to all coming tonight. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And thank you to the League. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Have a fabulous evening and happy spring.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.